Hey everyone, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. I wanted to do a video on a topic which is kind of a favorite thing of mine. Well, I mean, I did teach. I have a lot of topics I like quite a bit, but I definitely enjoy this one, and it's something which I haven't actually taught in a little while, and I was thinking about it the other day, and I decided to make a video about it. I had a little extra time today. It worked out. Um, Although I learned that playing tennis in 90-degree heat is really tiring, and I'm hoping I'm coherent. But it's all good. It was earlier in the day. I'll be fine. So, but if I blunder, that's what I'm blaming it on. Just so you guys know, if I make a mistake, it was just because the 90-degree heat. Nothing to do with my brain just not working very well. So, landing the decisive blow is what this is about. And what I mean by that is you're in a game, you're doing great, you have an attack built, you have some kind of initiative going, whatever it might be, but how do you find that key moment and land the blow that really finishes your opponent off? It sounds easy, but it's not the easiest thing to do, and a lot of that is because first of all you have to know when that moment is. That's a big part of it. There are some telltale signs. In this particular position we have on the board, right? Like black has basically the knight on b6, which isn't doing much, and this bishop on g7, the lone defender just standing there, like, please don't hurt me. And white has bishop, knight, queen, rook, like all these pieces pointed at the king. Black has a weak king, like the g pawn missing is not a great thing. And I don't think too much material to show for it. How many pawns is black up? Two pawns? As you can tell, I don't count material enough. Black's up two pawns, but the king's getting wrecked. This should be a moment, right? Sometimes it's less obvious. Sometimes you think it's a moment and it's not. You have to pull back or maybe take your time. Other times it's that moment. But for me, this is kind of one of those moments where, okay, you feel like black's position should be close to falling apart, but how do you actually dismantle it? How do you make it so that you're able to break through and do something good? So why don't you give it a try? It's white's move. What would you do here? And try to back it up with some calculation. One thing you'll find with these moments is generally there is calculation involved. You have to be very accurate and make sure you got everything right. So one of those things that is very tough, I think, for people is they tend to rush moments when they think they're about to win, or they try to make it so like, oh, I should win this really easily, and sometimes those kind of thoughts can really hold you back. In the game, actually, and this was played by a GM was white in this game. They actually played their knight back to h3, and I think the main reason they obviously calculated other moves, right? It wasn't like they didn't calculate it, but nothing looked easy, and they're like, oh, I should be so winning here. Am I not more winning? And sometimes that'll cause you to make decisions like this. And that h3 is actually a very big mistake because black in the game found this really nice move, f4. It blocks the bishop and knight. You can't really get back in. There's one tricky idea here, which is if white doesn't do anything, they're just kind of down two pawns. Black's going to start getting pieces out, start taking maybe take this d pawn. So it makes sense to try to sack a piece now, but now you're kind of not sacrificing on your terms so much. And black has some defensive resources. One, which is really nice, is this move f5. It blocks the bishop, and if you try to take on h6, for example, I can actually play this rook a7 move, get my rook in the defense. And then it's like all of a sudden I have defenders, I have things I can do, and being down a piece is not ideal unless you have something really good for it. So on that note, what should we do? And here it's actually relatively simple as far as the moves go. The hard part is calculating it out properly. So the simplest, I think, is bishop takes f5. You can play rook takes f5, is also quite winning, but it's not quite as clear. Like you sack the exchange, it looks really great. One key idea is that if knight takes d5, you have this move knight h7. So the idea is you hit the rook, but you're also threatening bishop takes h6 is a very, very crucial idea. And black just doesn't really have a great defense to these threats is the main problem. But to me, this is not a very simple way to go about it. The simplest, I think, is just bishop takes f5. So, of course, one key feature is that if h takes g, queen h7 is now mate. That would be unfortunate. So black will probably take. You take back. And there are, of course, many moves. One thing to mention is that if black does not take the knight on g5, right? If black leaves the knight, you're able to play, say, knight ge4. Then I think that the attack will kind of play itself. You'll be able to take on h6. The black king is open. And very importantly, you haven't really sacrificed anything, which means that you should be able to win it fairly easily. And keep in mind, there are other threats as well. Like knight takes f7 is a threat they have to deal with. So I don't know how they would deal with it. A move like queen e7, for example, is possible. But this is a case where I think just a very simple move like knight ge4, and you're threatening bishop takes h6, and black's kind of falling apart, right? So it's very important you don't feel like you have to find, all right, forced win in every single line. Often when you're doing problems, which of course you should be doing, that's often the case. But when you're trying to win a game, sometimes most lines don't require that. The main thing that is required, though, is that you figure out how to play here. And this is actually the tricky part, because bishop takes g5 is tempting, but after f6, followed by ideas like this again, it's not so easy to actually give checkmate here. So the key is that you have this move rook takes g5, and this is the key thing that you had to see. So the whole point is that you're not allowing this very major defensive resource because you're not giving it time. If black plays f6 here, you can immediately sacrifice and play bishop h6 check, and this is crushing because if black goes back here, you simply deliver mate. I already did the arrow, see that? I anticipated this. And if the king goes back elsewhere, h8, h7, it doesn't really matter. You're going to take the rook with check. And here you can even just come back is probably the simplest way. And you're threatening queen g6, the rook f1, f3, g3. Oven is preheated, ba-bam. See, I don't even know if you can hear that. Anyways, why I chose to do it now, who knows? It's all good. So, point is that f6 is not possible, and that is a really, really important feature. You're threatening rook takes g7. You're also just threatening queen h6. So if some kind of random move is played, queen h6 is good. Most moves do prevent that, though, I think. So, for example, if they play knight d7, the easiest way is just, again, to sack and check. And this is going to be absolutely crushing. Again, you can't go back here because of this check and mate. So you have to give up the rook again, or allow the queen to be won or something, right? Either way, it's not going to be too fun. So, yeah, I mean, black can try this. I thought was kind of a clever try. So threatening mate, you want to make sure you don't play knight e4 and then just feel sad for the rest of your life. But you play bishop e3, just get your pieces out. Knight e4 is coming. Black's going to have to sack their queen to not get mated. So this is kind of a relatively simple example of how this exists. But keep in mind, a Grandmaster player didn't play this correctly. No, it wasn't me. It might have been me, but it was not me. But the whole point is that, you need to be able to, number one, identify the moment that, okay, this is not the moment to retreat, this is the moment to attack, but you need to back that up with calculation. Another thing I would recommend is really pinpointing where your opponent is weak, right? In this case, it's very evident that their king side's weak, but exactly where, right? The hard part is this position. Seeing that, number one, if bishop takes, which looks so natural, developing your last piece with tempo, it cannot be more natural than that. And I'm going to guess that that's what the white player missed. That they were looking at bishop takes g5, couldn't find anything, and gave up, which is kind of reasonable. But if you do it this way, you notice that this is the really key weakness, and the fact that rook takes g7 is not really stoppable, in like apart from a move like queen f6, which gets you into huge trouble. And I think this is the key thing to realize, that this is the weakness, and you have to make sure that your opponent does not get this in, which brings me to my next point, which is pinpointing your opponent's defensive resources. It's very easy to see how you can attack, but a lot of people neglect to see how your opponent can defend. If you want to land a decisive blow and make it stick, you have to make sure you take their counterplay into account. That's what makes rook takes g5 so strong. You do not give black time to kind of build their shield with getting the rook in the game. And because you deny them that time, they're not able to establish a defense against your threats. So let's move to the next example. This is a position I've given this at my training camps I run once a month. I've given this to students. This is a position I really enjoy for various reasons. But this one is white to play. So once again, if you want to pause and try to figure out what you would play here as white, go right ahead. So once again, we're down 2 pawns. Apparently, that's just something I like. But at first, it looks kind of strange because their king again is weak. Particularly, I'm sure a lot of you noticed this pattern. And but that it's still hard to exploit. For example, obviously, if we trade queens, it looks great. But after knight b6, we don't actually checkmate them. We've given their king an escape square. This is not ideal. Their knight on h6 looks odd and kind of strange. So there's the very weak king, quite obviously a knight, but we're down 2 pawns, and how do we actually make a threat, right? Playing a move like queen e3, threatening knight b6 is very tempting. But one general issue is that black can probably move their b pawn here. So for example, even like a move like b5 is very dangerous. I was thinking b6 would be a bit safer. And this move looks kind of weird, but the idea is that if knight takes b6, we play king b7. This king's actually very hard to attack on b7. So a move like b6 really makes this very difficult. So the main thing, again, is you identify the weakness. So number one, obviously it's the king and this knight being weird, but those things are very general. I think the biggest thing is that you need to find a way to open lines. So how can you possibly open lines here? At the moment, your rooks, if you could get your rooks into the attack, the game would be over. If you were missing this c-pawn, the game would be over. You can't play what-ifs, though. So how do you actually open up the game for your rooks? You actually use the fact that this mate exists. Because the mate exists, this move is not a threat. Queen takes f3 allows knight b6 mate. This is not a threat. So when you think about the position in this way, it expands your options. Your move does not have to defend against queen takes f3. Normally, you would not be able to allow a queen trade here, but queen takes f3 is not, well, I was going to say not legal. It's technically legal. It's not advisable. So because of that, how can you open up the position? If you want to pause again, try to figure it out. If you didn't get it right the first time, go right ahead. But here is the key. You play the move d4. This is an excellent move with a very simple purpose. If black plays knight f5, for example, you play d5. You slam this pawn down, and they don't really have a good move. I mean, okay, knight f5 was particularly unfortunate because this is also hanging. But even aside from that, they just can't really play anything here. Right? If pawn takes pawn, even, I'm forgetting this knight's hanging, which is kind of dumb, but the idea is you're going to open up this. They can't move the queen even if takes. This isn't even a fork, it's just mates. So let me play like an example that's a little bit harder to deal with. A move like f6. So there's no knight hanging. Even here, after f5 takes, rook takes d5, for example, because again, the queen can't move, right? It has to guard this mate. But it also can't allow this check. Like if you play here and allow this check, this is also going to be really, really sad. I mean, check here, and this king is on borrowed time. Let's just say, even a move like trying to bring the rook in. I haven't checked this, but this looks this looks pretty over, threatening everything in the world. This king is not long for this world. So, I think that this kind of thing would be bad. Rook takes d5 is possible. And you can actually win an exchange. You can take this, give a check, be a little extra fancy, take another pawn, and take here. This should be winning with the active pieces. Black has a couple pawns for the exchange, but white's pieces are way better. This should be quite winning. But what's quite funny here is that after rook takes d5, even if you just say, okay, no problem, you leave black with the worst pieces on earth. And this position may even be worse. You're just going to play rook c1, and black has absolutely no way to defend against all these threats. It's just completely impossible. And for that reason, this is completely crushing. So this move d4 is just unbelievably strong. Once again, queen takes f3, you have knight b6 mates. The best defense might be a move like bishop d6. So now this is a threat. But you can throw in this move d5, queen c7, and then just take this pawn. And here you're forking these two pieces. And it's very, very difficult. If black just lets you take the knight, this might be their best, actually. But now you're just up a piece. And if they try to play like this and sack an exchange, you also just shove the pawns down their throat. This is also going to be really unfortunate. So kind of a neat position. Really, really cool position. But the key is this d5 idea exists. And notice how they also do get punished for the knight on h6. Because bishop d6 is really the only way to defend, to try to give the queen the c7 square, it fails because their pieces are vulnerable on the king side. So notice how the knight on h6 also comes into play. So spotting a move like this is a bit different because it's quite obvious their king is a little bit weak, but it's not obvious exactly how we exploit that. Unlike the previous position where it looked like we have so many ways to crash through, here it actually looks very difficult to do. But when you establish that you want to open up the center of the board if you're able to, you establish the tactics that queen takes f3 is not a playable move, and you see black's defensive resource, right? Getting the king out in response to a move like queen e3 is a very important defensive resource that you want to take into account. So you spot the opponent's defensive resource, you try to break open their position with something like d4, d5, and you make sure you calculate moves like bishop d6, etc. So as you can see, it's very, very nice for white. All right, so let's move to the last one. This is a position where I really would, I probably was checking to see if I've given this in a video before. It's one of those where it's like, it's a position that's really cool. It was played in a game by Magnus Carlsen, I believe. And it's just one of those which is really cool. So very, very different type of position. Believe it or not, we're actually up 2 pawns here. It's shocking I'm giving you a position on material. But at the moment, our pieces are really tied up and everything's kind of awkward. So the question is, how should we land a decisive blow in a position where we're actually up material, but there's lots of, our pieces are really tied up and it looks kind of awkward. So how should we try to land a decisive blow here? Once again, pause your video if you'd like. So once again, we want to do the kind of same things, which is we're trying to establish where black's weak. So at the moment, we're very tied up, and if we give black a couple of moves to consolidate their pieces, right? Like this knight on h7 is really bizarre. They might want to improve their knight. They might try to improve their king, even go after our pawn someday, which could become very weak. But yeah, the knight coming into the game, the king improving, these are the main things that they want to do. However, at the moment, one thing that you'd notice is that this diagonal is horribly weak. Really, really bad. And that might give us resources. So one idea is to play a move like bishop takes b4. So the point of this move is that if allowed, we have this check. So for example, if black goes down this rabbit hole, we have this beautiful check. So even though we're down a rook for 3 pawns, we have this check. If they go here, we deliver mate and feel great about ourselves. They do have this move knight f6. It's very important you spot moves like this, by the way. You have no idea how many people just assume it's mate and they don't look further. You always want to see the resources for your opponent. In this case, it's pitching a piece to move their rook. And we play a move like this, and it's quite clear that even though black is up in exchange, we have 3 pawns. This bishop's going to have to move. We're going to probably get a queen. This is very, very nice for us. But there's a problem, which is that after bishop takes b4, they can actually take our rook. And so they're still covering this square, and after rook takes c2, they'll play bishop takes b4. And even though we're going to have compensation for the piece, I highly doubt we're going to lose after something like knight takes g6 and even knight back. I don't really feel like we're trying to win. Even if we end up with 4 pawns for the piece, our pawns are not that good right now. The piece should be pretty active. Just in general, unless your pawns get really far, it's going to be very difficult to win. So I don't recommend this. So the question is, how does Carlsen find a way to use it? Once again, if you want to pause to try to figure it out, if you thought bishop takes b4 was the move, or you were not sure, go right ahead. But his move is bishop c1. Absolutely gorgeous move. And it's one of those things where it's like really awing when you see a move like this. Like, wow, how did he come up with this? And the fact is that when you've seen lots of patterns, it becomes easier. I don't want to imply that it's not impressive, because it's extremely impressive. But I'm going to guess if you show this position to a bunch of GMs, they're going to come up with bishop c1. Maybe not as quickly and accurately as he did, of course. But the whole point with bishop c1 is that you recognize that this is a thing. But notice how it still has to be backed up by precise calculation. Bishop takes b4, you have to calculate precisely in order to see that it doesn't work. Again, taking into account how your opponent can respond. So in this case, if they start by taking the rook and we take, this simplification worked very much in our favor, because we're still threatening this. They can get their king out, but here we have all sorts of things we can do. Notice how we got rid of the awkwardness, all those pins that were kind of giving us a headache, they're gone. And this is kind of where you want to switch from, all right, tactically I want to wreck my opponent, to what's the simplest way I can win this? And the simplest way, in my view, is actually just letting them have the pawn, grabbing this bishop. They probably take with the knight, and then we just go after this pawn. I always forget I do the arrows ahead of time. Goodness. And once we have two connected passers against 0 on the queen side, I think we should win very easily. But notice how this is one of the hardest things when you're trying to win a game. Switching between, all right, I'm going to find some cool tactics, to, all right, let me just simplify the game into a one endgame, is very difficult to do. And one of the keys is to be able, and one thing really strong players can do, is they're able to switch modes quicker. They can go from finding cool tactics, all right, trade the knight for the bishop and win the pawn. Knowing your moment is important. You can try to win with this f-pawn, I guess, like try to do things, but you're more likely to get into trouble or spoil the win, I think, than win in an easy way. I don't want to imply that knight e6 is the only way to win, but I think that something like that would almost make, a GM resign, say. Obviously, not saying you should resign necessarily, but I do think that's the simplest way. So rook takes f2 check, and rook takes d1, I think, was played and is a much better choice. Bishop b2 check. So we actually end up in the same situation as before. So we've landed the blow, we play knight e6, we're feeling great about ourselves, they play bishop d6, but how do you actually finish this game? We haven't finished the game yet. The game is still going. Our opponent has not done us the courtesy of resigning. So how would you go about winning this position? I want to preface this by saying there are many winning moves or winning methods here. I'm going to show you what I like best once you come back. I don't know where you're going, but whatever. And we'll see. But yeah, take your time. Try to figure out how you would win this. So as I mentioned, seeing your opponent's resources is very important. So one thing is, if you queen, this is actually a severe mistake because takes and king here, and the problem is that if you retreat, they double attack our pieces. And this puts us in an awkward spot. The same thing if we grab this pawn. And keep in mind, we really do not want to give up a piece here, because this pawn, like if they win these two pawns, they probably win the game in a lot of cases. So this is not something I would recommend. We can play bishop e7, so we're not doing too badly. But the problem is they can check and grab this pawn, and then grab this pawn. And it's going to be more likely to be a draw than a win. Once all the queenside pawns are gone, winning a position like this is going to be very difficult. Knight and bishop are great when there's more pawns on the board, or you have a pawn that's going, the knight and bishop supported, great. But once there are lots of pawns eliminated, it's very difficult to win with a knight and bishop with everything on the same side when the pawns get super reduced. So I'm not saying that's just a dead draw, but I would say that it's leaning towards a draw. And regardless of whether that's a draw or not, that's not really what we want. We should be able to win in a much simpler fashion. So the key here, and this is something Carlsen in particular does this very well, is he realizes that he does not have to rush. And this is an important thing. You've played a move like bishop c1, you feel so proud of yourself. You're like, yeah, look at me, tactical genius, right? But then you have to go into technical mode. And what that often means is, what is my plan to win this game? Obviously, at some point, you're going to win that bishop. That is clear. But the question is, can you change how you do it? Can you accomplish something first? And what I really like is making sure pawns stay on the board. In particular, I want just enough pawns I can win this easily. Because if I have enough pawns and my pieces control the pawns, it's going to be good. So the move I like, once again, not the only way to win. I like this h4 move. So what this does is it ensures these two pawns get locked up. They're not moving. We control this square. We have a beautiful square for our bishop if we need it. And it's just going to be very difficult. So black will probably play check, something like this. And let's say they grab the pawn on a2. Again, it's not the only way to play, but I think that it makes sense. So here, once again, we don't want a queen, but we can play this sneaky move, bishop e5. So we're threatening the bishop trade. Obviously, they cannot take it because we get a fresh queen. And fresh queens are always better than stale queens. Little known fact. Bishop e7. And now, so we could go back and forth if we want to be cute about it. I would say that be careful doing that, because sometimes you'll miss something or you'll have to calculate and then you realize you've given up time and you're like, why did I repeat? There's this thing like GMs always repeat, which is sometimes true, especially if you need time. Definitely repeat moves once, but be very careful. You can do it 3 times by accident. That's a disaster, because then they can claim a draw. Or you'll just have to think, because it's like, wait, there's some weird rook a6 tactic. What is happening? None of it works, but it's important not to get too carried away with that sort of thing. In any case, queens is good here, and the whole point is that now your knight and bishop are separated. So a move like king g8, you can take this g pawn, for example, or more likely you're actually going to come back and defend your b pawn, so it won't be too dissimilar. But let's say they play here, just to not give you the option. I like throwing in this check just because now you don't have to deal with g5. You throw in this check and you play knight d4. And the whole point is now your king is just going to run towards that pawn, and there's not really much they can do. It's a position where your bishop controls these pawns beautifully. Notice how this pawn can never advance. You see why I played h4? Having to deal with g5 would be a bit annoying. So you have this side of the board defended, and this side is just going to collapse. And this is a good moment for Brack to contemplate life and maybe going to get lunch or something, because this is pretty sad. But notice how you control both sides of the board. This is what the pieces do very well. They can render a rook useless if there are no targets. So the reason I like a move like h4 is that it's something like it keeps the game very simple and makes it so that a king can go after a pawn. I would challenge you, when you're trying to figure out ways to win positions like this, to think of ways you would do it. Because keep in mind, a computer is not necessarily going to give this. A computer doesn't care if the game is complicated. For them, it's easy. So sometimes they're actually not so useful at finding moves like h4. But from a human standpoint, it's so much easier to win this position now that we've fixed the pawn structure. Now we've made it so much easier. I'm not saying the game is over. Maybe Black can try, playing like rook a8 and trying to do this to us. I'm not saying that, our work is completely finished. But I am saying that it's, we're doing pretty well, and we should be able to find a way to win. For example, king d3 threatening this here, and now maybe bishop d2. And at some point we can probably take this pawn if we feel like it. Maybe we'll try something different. Maybe after king here we'll decide to take. Maybe we'll decide to go back here and try to take with the knight. We have different options. I'm not saying that there's only one way to do this. But the point is that we've made it much easier for ourselves because we've stabilized both sides of the board. I would say with a position like this, stability is king. So learning how to land the decisive blow is just an incredibly important skill, because winning a one game, and this is something I'm sure a lot of you have heard, is one of the hardest things to do. So number one, you want to spot, if you want to be able to identify the moments. Usually it's a moment where you have some kind of either a huge initiative or you're up tons of material or something, and you're in a position where you have your forces ready, things are ready, like your opponent has a vulnerability or a weakness, and you're kind of ready to pounce. The next thing you want to do, make sure you see your opponent's resources, whether it's with a defensive resource, whether they have a tactic or a way to play for initiative themselves, and then calculate carefully and accurately. These are not moments to rush. These are moments, no matter how excited you are, you're about to win the game. I know, it's a great feeling. It's a great feeling. But make sure you're careful, because those are the moments people mess up the most. And if you take your time and you're able to do this, it's something you can improve at. But it's something you never quite master. It's a hard thing to do. But the more you practice it, the better you will become. But hopefully this gave you some cool positions at least, and made it a little more clear on what to do when you get in those situations yourself. Anyway, time for me to make some dinner. But good luck everyone, and I'll catch you next time.